Welcome to Games from Folktales, a podcast that mixes historical research and tabletop role-playing settings. I'm your host, Timothy Ferguson. This week we return to the biography of Benvenuto Cellini. At this stage, Cellini has made his way to Paris and entered the service of King Francis I. King Francis gives him use of a castle in Paris, but, and this is why I included it, you'll notice when he says, someone already lives there and I can't get him out, the king says, well, just go and beat him up. This is the attitude to violence that you also find in Elizabeth's England, in Magonomia. People don't expect the law of itself to have strength. After we see Cellini take over his fortress by force, we skip forward a few weeks and there's a bit of a discussion about how Cellini is working one day in his smithy when the king rocks up unannounced to have a look at how he's doing. I've included that because it has a certain feeling of what a Veditus Magus workshop might look like in Ars Magica. After that, we skip forward an extra day, and I've cut some bits out. Cellini is invited to not dine, but attend the king and the Cardinal of Ferrara while they are dining. During this, they ask him to make a salt cellar for the king, which matches some candelabras he's made previously. Cellini agrees to do so. The king asks how much it will cost, and Cellini says it will be 1,000 ducats. Now, the 1,000 ducats in this case are not a payment, they are being melted down. So the king gives orders to his treasurer to go through and find the best pieces of old gold. Now, the reason old gold is important is because the French currency has been repeatedly debased, so the older the gold, the purer it is. And the king doesn't want his salt cellar made out of brass. Partially, this is just a wealth thing, but also chemically, it's quite a good thing. Gold doesn't affect the flavour of things like salt, which is put inside it. Copper, however, does. Also, copper discolours in the presence of salt. Cellini gets the 1,000 gold pieces, puts them in a little breadbasket he's carrying, and asks the groom of the treasurer to go and tell his young men to come and accompany him home. His young men don't turn up. The groom offers to carry the money for Cellini, and he says, no, I'll carry it myself. As he's leaving, he sees some servants whispering and fears, rightly, an ambush. The recordings I've been using for these episodes have all come from LibriVox. The 3 sections following are all by Chris Caron. Thanks to Chris and his production team.
On our way to the lodgings, if the king we passed before those of the Cardinal of Ferrara, standing at his door, he called to me and said, our most Christian monarch has of his own accord assigned you the same appointments which his Majesty allowed the painter Leonardo da Vinci, that is, a salary of 700 crowns. In addition, he will pay you for all the works you do for him, also for your journey. Hither he gives you 500 golden crowns, which will be paid you before you quit this place. At the end of this announcement, I replied that those were offers worthy of the great king he was. The messenger, not knowing anything about me, and hearing what splendid offers had been made me by the king, begged my pardon over and over again. On the day following, I went to thank the king, who ordered me to take the models of 12 silver statues, which were to stand as candelabra round his table. He wanted them to represent 6 gods and 6 goddesses, and to have exactly the same height as his Majesty, which was a trifle under 4 cubits. Having dictated this commission, he returned to his treasurer and asked whether he had paid me the 500 crowns. The official said that he had received no orders to that effect. The king took this very ill, for he had requested the cardinal to speak to him about it. Furthermore, he had told me to go to Paris and seek out a place to live in, fitted in the execution of such work. He could see that I obtained it. I got the 500 crowns of gold, and took up my quarters at Paris in a house of the Cardinal of Ferrara, where I began, in God's name, to work and fashion 4 little waxen models, about 2/3 of a cubit each in height. They were Jupiter, Juno, Apollo, and Vulcan. In this, while the king returned to Paris, whereupon I went to him at once, taking my models with me, and my 2 prentices, Ascanio and Pagolo. On perceiving that the king was pleased with my work, and being commissioned to execute the Jupiter in silver of the height above described, I introduced the 2 young men, and said that I had brought them with me out of Italy to serve his Majesty. For insomuch as they had been brought up by me, I could at the beginning get more help from them than from the Paris workmen. To this the king replied, that I might name a salary which I thought sufficient for their maintenance. I said that 100 crowns of gold apiece would be quite proper, and that I would make them earn their wages well. This agreement was concluded. Then I said that I had found a place which seemed to me exactly suited to my industry. It was His Majesty's own property, and called the Little Nello. The provost of Paris was then in possession of it from His Majesty, but since the provost made no use of the castle, His Majesty perhaps might grant it to me to employ in his service. He replied upon the instant, "That place is my own house, and I know well that the man I gave it to does not inhabit or use it, so you shall have it for the work you have to do." He then told his lieutenant to install me in the Nello. This officer made some resistance, pleading that he could not carry out the order. The king answered in anger that he meant to bestow his property on whom he pleased, and on a man who would serve him, seeing that he got nothing from the other. Therefore he would hear no more about it. The lieutenant then submitted that some small force would have to be employed in order to effect an entrance, to which the king answered, "Go then, and if a small force is not enough, use a great one." The officer took me immediately to the castle. There he put me in possession, if not, however, without violence. After that he warned me to take very good care that I was not murdered. I installed myself, enrolled serving men, and bought a quantity of pikes and partisans. But I remained for several days exposed to grievous annoyances, for the provost was a great nobleman of Paris, and all the other gentlefolk took part against me. They attacked me with such insults that I could hardly hold my own against them. I must not omit to mention that I entered the service of His Majesty in the year 1540, which was exactly the year in which I reached the age of 40. The affronts and insults I received made me have recourse to the king, begging His Majesty to establish me in some other place. He answered, "Who are you, and what is your name?" I remained in great confusion, and could not comprehend what he meant. Holding my tongue thus, the king repeated the same words a second time angrily. Then I said my name was Benvenuto. "If, then, you are Benvenuto, of whom I have heard," replied the king, "act according to your wont, for you have my full leave to do so." I told His Majesty that all I wanted was to keep his favour. For the rest I knew nothing that could harm me. He gave a little laugh and said, "Go your ways, then. You shall never want my favour." Upon this he told his first secretary, Monsignor de Villeroy, to see me provided and accommodated with all I needed. This Villeroy was an intimate friend of the provost, to whom the castle had been given. It was built in a triangle right up against the city walls, and was of some antiquity, but had no garrison. The building was of considerable size. Monsignor de Villeroy counselled me to look about for something else, and by all means to leave this place alone, seeing that its owner was a man of vast power, who would most absurdly have me killed. I answered that I had come from Italy to France only in order to serve that illustrious king, and as for dying, I knew for certain that die I must. A little earlier or a little later was the matter of supreme indifference to me. Now Villeroy was a man of the highest talent, exceptionally distinguished in all points, and possessed of vast wealth. There was nothing he would not gladly have done to harm me, but he made no open demonstration of his mind. He was grave and a noble presence, and spoke slowly, at his ease, to another gentleman, Marmagna, the treasurer of Languedoc. He left the duty of molesting me. The first thing which this man was to look out the best apartments in the castle, and to have them fitted up for himself. I told him that the king had given me the place to serve him in, and that I did not choose it should be occupied by any but myself and my attendants. The fellow, who was haughty, bold, and spirited, replied that he meant to do just what he liked, that I should run my head against the wall if I presumed to oppose him, and that Villeroy had given him authority to do what he was doing. I told him that, by the king's authority given to me, neither he nor Villeroy could do it. When I said that, he gave vent to offensive language in French. whereat I retorted in my own tongue that he lied. Stung with rage, he clapped his hand upon a little dagger which he had. Then I set my hand also to a large dirk, which I always wore for my defence, and cried out, "If you dare to draw, I'll kill you on the spot." He had 2 servants to back him, and I had only my 2 lads. For a moment or two Marmagna stood in doubt, not knowing exactly what to do, but rather inclined to mischief, and muttering, "I will never put up with such insults." Seeing then that the affair was taking a bad turn, I took a sudden resolution, and cried to Pagolo and Ascanio, "When you see me draw my dirk, throw yourselves upon those serving men, and kill them if you can. I mean to kill this fellow at the first stroke, and then we will decamp together with God's grace." Marmagna, when he understood my purpose, was glad enough to get alive out of the castle. All these things tonight. I had been some time at home, and was hard at work, when the King arrived at the door of the castle, and heard our hammers going. He bade his company keep silence. Everybody in my house was busily employed, so that the unexpected entrance of his Majesty took me by surprise. The first thing he saw on coming into the great hall was myself with a huge plate of silver in my hand, which I was beating for the body of my Jupiter. One of my men was finishing the head, another the legs, and it is easy to imagine what a din we made between us. It happened that a little French lad was working at my side, who had just been guilty of something trifling blunder. I gave the lad a kick, and, as my good luck would have it, caught him with my foot exactly in the fork between his legs, and sent him spinning several yards, so that he came stumbling up against the King precisely at the moment when his Majesty arrived. The King was vastly amused, but I felt covered with confusion. He began to ask me that I was engaged upon, and told me to go on working. Then he said that he would much rather have me not employ my strength on manual labour, but take as many men as I wanted, and make them do the rough work. He should like me to keep myself in health, in order that he might enjoy my services through many years to come. I replied to his Majesty that the moment I left off working I should fall ill, also that my art itself would suffer, and not attain the mark I aimed at for his Majesty. Thinking that I spoke thus only to brag, and not because it was the truth, he made the Cardinal of Lorraine repeat what he had said. But I explained my reasons so fully and clearly that the Cardinal perceived my drift. He then advised the King to let me labour as much or little as I liked. Being very well satisfied with what he had seen, the King returned to his palace, after bestowing on me too many marks of favour to be here recorded. 1,000 crowns, I answered. He called his treasurer at once, who was the Viscount of Orbec, and ordered him that very day to disburse me 1,000 crowns of good weight in old gold. When I left his Majesty, I went for the 2 notaries who had helped me in procuring silver for the Jupiter, and many other things. Crossing the Seine, I then took a small hand-basket, which one of my cousins, a nun, had given me on my journey through Florence. It made for my good fortune that I took this basket, and not a bag. So then, thinking I could do the business by daylight, for it was still early, and not caring to interrupt my workmen, and being indisposed to take a servant with me, I set off alone. When I reached the house of the treasurer, I found that he had the money laid out before him, and was selecting the best pieces as the King has ordered. It seemed to me, however, that the thief of a treasurer was doing all he could to postpone the payment of the money, nor were the pieces counted out until 3 hours after nightfall. I meanwhile was not wanting in despatch, for I sent word to several of my journeymen that they should come and attend me, since the matter was one of serious importance. When I found that they did not arrive, I asked the messenger if he had done my errand. The rascal of a groom whom I sent replied that he had done so, but that they answered that they could not come. He, however, would gladly carry the money for me. I answered that I meant to carry the money myself. But this time the contract was drawn up and signed. On the money being counted, I put it all into my little basket, and then thrust my arm through the 2 handles. Since I did this, and some difficulty, the gold was well shut in, and I carried it more conveniently than if the vehicle had been a bag. I was well armed with shirt and sleeves of mail, and having my sword and dagger at my side, made off along the street as quick as my 2 legs would carry me. Just as I left the house, I observed some servants whispering among themselves, who also went off at a round pace in another direction from the one I took. Walking with all haste, I passed the bridge of the Exchange, and went up along a wall beside the river, which led to my lodging in the castle. I had come to the Augustines. Now this was a very perilous passage, and though it was only 500 paces distant from my dwelling, yet the lodging in the castle being quite as far removed inside, no one could have heard my voice if I had shouted, when I saw 4 men with 4 swords in their hands advancing to attack me. My resolution was taken in an instant. I covered the basket with my cape, drew my sword, and seeing that they were pushing hotly forward, cried aloud, "With soldiers there is only the cape and sword to gain, and these, before I give them up, I hope you'll get not much to your advantage." Then crossing my sword boldly with them, I more than once spread out my arms, in order that, if the ruffians were put on by the servants, who had seen me, to take my money, they might be led to judge I was not carrying it. The encounter was soon over, for they retired step by step, carrying along themselves in their own language. This is a brave Italian, and certainly not the man we are after, or if he be the man, he cannot be carrying anything. I spoke Italian, and kept harrying them with thrust and slash so hotly that I narrowly missed killing one of the other. My skill in using the sword made them think I was a soldier, rather than a fellow of some other calling. They drew together, and began to fall back, muttering all the while beneath their breath in their own tongue. I meanwhile continued always calling out, but not too loudly, that those who wanted my cape and blade would have to get them with some trouble. Then I quickened pace, while they still followed slowly at my heels. This augmented my fear, for I thought I might be falling into an ambuscade, which would have cut me off in front as well as rear. Accordingly, when I was at the distance of 100 paces from my home, I ran with all my might, and shouted at the top of my voice, "To arms! To arms! Out with you! Out with you! I am being murdered!" In a moment 4 of my young men came running, with 4 pikes in their hands. They wanted to pursue the ruffians, who could still be seen, but I stopped them, calling back, so as to let the villains hear, "Those cowards yonder, 4 against 1 man alone, had not pluck enough to capture 1,000 golden crowns in metal, which have almost broken this arm of mine. Let us haste inside and put the money away. Then I will take my big 2-handed sword, and go with you whithersoever you like." We went inside to secure the gold, and my lads, while expressing the deep concern for the peril I had run, gently chided me, and said, "You risk yourself too much alone. The time will come when you will make us all bemoan your loss." 1,000 words and exclamations were exchanged between us. My adversaries took to flight, and we all sat down and supped together with mirth and gladness, laughing over to those great blows which fortune strikes for good as well as evil, and which, what time they do not hit the mark, are just the same as though they had not happened.
Your saga may vary.